Today is the 8th Sunday in Ordinary Time, and today we're going to be talking about the blind leading the blind, the splinter versus the log, a tree bearing good fruit, and the meaning of your words. Also, we'll talk about the saints of the day, Saint Agnes and Saint Charles. And for our miracle discussion, we will talk about the Shroud of Turin. Lots of good stuff, lots to get into, so let's jump right into the readings. Our first reading is from Sirach and touches on the idea that our words reflect our true intentions. It says here, praise no one before he speaks, for it is then that people are tested, and also ties it to saying, the fruit of a tree shows the care it has had, so too does one's speech disclose the bent of one's mind, setting up this theme that our words are reflective of our heart and our mind, which is kind of a weird and honestly unexpected take and direction than I was really anticipating here to start off these readings talking about bearing good fruit, which I mostly associate with doing good works, and words don't mean much. But here from the offset, it's saying that your words do strongly reflect and indicate your true heart, and it touches on that more in the gospel, which we'll talk about in a minute. And then in Corinthians, our second reading, it talks about the fact that which is corruptible and mortal needs to clothe itself with incorruptibility and immortality in order to have victory over death, and reinforces that mortal flesh and blood cannot enter heaven unless it is transformed, which it will be transformed at the end of time, purifying us into a state that we can enter heaven, body and soul. And then we jump into the gospel. We're continuing the gospel of Luke, again, pretty early on in Jesus' ministry, and we were picking up pretty much right where he left off, though now he's specifically talking to his apostles and starts by giving them a parable, starting with, can the blind lead the blind? Which goes directly into how can you be pointing out the splinter in your brother's eye when you ignore the log in your own eye, and then rounds it out by talking about a good tree bears good fruit, an evil tree bears evil fruit. People don't go to a bad tree expecting good things. And when I first heard these in Mass and, reread them for this, I was kind of thinking to myself, like, yeah, I've heard this all before. I get it. Be a good person, produce good works, pretty standard stuff we're all used to. Take care of my own life and everything before I try and reach out to other people. But the more I thought about it and the more I read it, I feel like there's the flip side of this that at least I often miss out on whenever I'm reading this. And so you go back to the blind leading the blind, not just referring to you and me going and giving undue advice to somebody, or like with the splinter and log, we have the log in our eye and we're trying to mess with the person who just has the splinter. And so we're giving undue influence or undue advice. But the flip side of that is we need to keep in mind of who are we taking advice from. Maybe we're the blind person being led by the other person, or maybe we have the splinter and we're listening to someone give undue advice to us. And then you go back to Sirach, where it's talking about praise no man before he speaks, for that's when he's tested. Whenever you read beyond that too, it says that we need to limit the amount of time we spend among stupid people, avoid conversations with fools, and that being around these people, their cursing is painful to hear. It's painful for our ears. And so I think it is talking about, we need to make sure we're in check before we try and reach out to somebody else. But I think it also is a warning of look out, watch out who you're taking advice from and who you're listening to, and broadly what you're putting in your head. Because everything that you're outputting into the world from your speech and your actions and everything are going to be a reflection of what you're inputting into your mind, which again ties back to that first reading where it says one's speech discloses the bent of one's mind, where sure, you can be deceitful and you can lie and do all that stuff, but your true reflection is going to be shown through how you speak, because everything that you're outputting is a reflection of what you're inputting. And unfortunately today, most of the inputs that we have are negative. It's pretty difficult to have a cell phone and a TV and listen to music and stuff like that and not have negative influence, on your mind. And it's not like you got to be a prude and, you can't watch anything that's over a PG movie or something like that, or can't listen to any music, you can't do any of that stuff. But it's kind of like alcohol. Having a drink's not a bad thing. Alcohol isn't evil. There's plenty of good things that alcohol brings, camaraderie and whatever else. But if you're drinking all the time every day, that's definitely going to negatively affect you. I think it's the same thing with, you listening to some maybe trashier music, or you're watching a TV show or a movie that's maybe more R-rated or whatever. Not a big deal. But if that's all that you're consuming and that's all that you're putting in your mind, that is going to skew your mind. It's going to fundamentally change how you think and speak and act and interact with other people because you have no other stimulus going into you. And so if you are that person, then you roll right into the splinter versus the log thing, then it's like, yeah, you probably are the person with the log in your eye, and you shouldn't be giving out advice to other people until your mind's clear, until you've cleared all that stuff out and you're in a better, more focused space. And a quick side note on the splinter versus the log imagery here. I think this is a good reflection of kind of Jesus's personality because he is quite funny. Whenever he's telling these parables and stuff, they are usually kind of outrageous a little bit, grab people's attention, and they are humorous. Now, we've heard it a billion times, and so it's probably lost on us, but there's a story back when I was in high school and my religion teacher was talking to me, and he said that whenever he read this out to his class, there was a person there who was not Christian. They had not grown up hearing any of this. And so he heard it for the first time and burst out laughing because he thought the imagery was so funny of a person having a log in their eye trying to talk to this person with the splinter. And it was like genuinely a funny thing to hear for the first time. And so in our minds, I feel like when we're imagining Jesus speaking, it's very solemn and he's talking very seriously, and all the apostles are like sitting there very seriously and hanging on every word. But whenever he speaks, a lot of interactions that he has are kind of lighter when you read into what he's saying. It is kind of funny, which is something to keep in mind whenever you are reading the gospel. Back to the idea, though, of what you're putting in your head. Again, you also have to reflect on who you're listening to and what are those people putting into their heads. Is their advice worth listening to or not? Because you can really get screwed up really quickly by listening to the wrong people. Beyond this verse in particular is often used again to kind of give a slap on the wrist to Christians who are evangelizing or who are calling out sin or calling out actions that go against Christ. It's usually those type of people will get pushback and saying like, hey, how about you worry about your own thing and we'll worry about our stuff over here, pushing this mentality of like, I'll take care of me and you take care of you, and as long as we're not interacting and hurting each other, then we're totally fine. But that is not what it says here. Again, Jesus never, ever calls you to be passive or to ignore things that are sinful or wrong or not call it out or something like that. Because if you read what it says here, it says, remove the log from your own eye and then remove the splinter. He doesn't say ignore the splinter. The splinter is still a problem. It still needs to be addressed and taken out. But if you need to take care of your own place first, then do that and then go remove the splinter. Don't ignore it. Don't be passive. It is still a problem. From here, he then talks about a good tree bears good fruit. You will know a person by the fruits that they bear, which again ties back directly to Sirach. The fruit of a tree shows the care it has had, so too does one's speech disclose the bent of the mind. And I keep bringing that up because your words and your actions do both matter. When I was reading this originally, I was kind of confused for a while. I was like, why does it keep talking about speech so much? Because it talks about speech in Sirach at the top, saying that that kind of is the reflection of your heart. And at the end of talking about a good tree bearing good fruit, or like an evil person produces evil, it says evil people produce evil, for from the fullness of the heart the mouth speaks. And it talks about how speech is the determinative factor of the reflection of your soul and your heart and your true intentions. When today, speech really isn't given much credence at all. We're kind of used to the notion of like, well, words without action mean nothing, and actions speak louder than words, and all that stuff that essentially writes off speech entirely, especially when it comes to entire careers like politicians, for example. Everybody just immediately writes off anything that they say as like, oh, well, they're a politician. They'll say whatever they need to say. Let's see what they actually do. And so it perplexed me how much emphasis they put on speaking and how much what they say actually matters. And the way that I think this is being said is in that context of what you're inputting into your head is going to be what you output into the world. It is going to be a reflection of what you're taking in. And so, yeah, you can lie and you can deceive and you can do all that. But at the end of the day, you can't disguise your true self forever. It's going to come out eventually. And that's one of the best things about free speech, for example, is if you have somebody you disagree with, most of the time, you can just let them speak. You let them talk, and they will vindicate you on all the things that you're accusing you of most of the time. But you do need both. You do need both words and action. Because when he's talking about a good tree bearing good fruit, and you're not going to go to the brambles looking for grapes, you're not going to go to someplace evil looking for good. That's saying that you need to be on the lookout and be vigilant for those people claiming to be good, but not producing it. Which again, I think ties back to that idea of pay attention to who you're listening to, because there's no quicker way to have your movement or your religion or whatever it is be hijacked and misdirected than to have some people who are like 75% of the way right and agree with you take the lead and start gradually steering the ship off course. Because most of the time, your great enemy that you're facing isn't like a giant, big, obvious enemy with like a target painted on their forehead. It's usually something subversive. It's usually a very gentle and not noticeable drifting away from the original path you were on over years and years and years. And then one day you just look up and you wonder, how did I get over here? The enemy usually is not dumb enough to let you know that it's the enemy. There are people who are going to pretend to be on your side, pretend to care and understand and want the best for whatever movement it is, when in reality they're taking over to steer it in a different direction. But you can always tell, again, by the actual actions, by what they're bearing, and by listening to what they're actually saying. And you can even see that description or that type of discussion of evil be sort of a call forward to Revelation or to the Antichrist, right? Because the whole idea of the Antichrist is that they're going to be a false savior. They're going to be the false second coming of Christ, and they're going to lead a lot of people astray as they attempt to hijack this religion. And no, I don't think that's going to be, Pope Francis. I know a lot of people don't like Pope Francis. A lot of people have said that he's the Antichrist or whatever. At least they did a few years ago. I don't know how much of that now. But I know the guy's not super popular. I will say I did not like Pope Francis for a while until I actually did start reading what he was saying, which I guess kind of reflects back to these biblical readings of their mouth truly reflecting their heart. And while you do see a lot of headlines about the guy, about stuff that he said or certain judgments he's passed, a lot of them are just headlines. The way that he writes is confusing and ambiguous, which is not good. But he writes like full paragraph dissertations on any issue that he's asked. He doesn't give a simple yes or no like previous popes. And so a lot of times you can take something that he said, one of the lines from his dissertation, and run that as a headline, and it sounds pretty bad out of context. But if you do sit down and read fully what Pope Francis says about pretty much any given issue, it all is pretty normal and pretty reasonable. So I definitely encourage doing that anytime a controversy shows up, and pay attention to who's telling you that the Pope is evil, who's telling you that the Pope, the leader of the Catholic Church, is wrong and leading you astray. I would analyze that person and their intentions very carefully, and their knowledge, how much they know about it, very carefully before listening to them and deciding that they're correct and the Pope, the leader of the Catholic Church, is incorrect. Because you are your mind. You are what you are putting into it. You are who you listen to. You are who you fill your mind with. And that is how you're reflected outwards. So just take care to fill it with something worthwhile. On to the saints of the day. Now, I have two here because technically on the Catholic calendar today is Saint Agnes of Bohemia's day, but also this is Saint Charles the Good's feast day. So we have two here, and their stories are actually kind of similar, so I thought I would just go ahead and do both of them here. Starting with Saint Agnes, now this was a lady who was born the daughter of a king, the King of Bohemia, and her mother was the sister of King Andrew of Hungary. So she's a very influential, part of a very influential, very powerful family. And like any daughter of nobility, there were arranged marriages and things like that set up to strengthen alliances between people and kingdoms, all pretty normal stuff. And so she has this arranged marriage. She's going to be married to the King of Germany. That falls through. She's then arranged to be married to somebody else. But that gets pushed away because the emperor wanted to marry her himself. But then things take a turn for Agnes, and she chooses instead to devote her life to Christ and leaves this life of royalty and everything behind, and actually pleads to the Pope, Pope Gregory, for help in this matter. And the emperor at the time, Frederick, says, "If she had left me for a mortal man, I would have taken vengeance with the sword. but I cannot take offense because in preference to me, she has chosen the king of heaven. So definitely not a sore loser, which is good. And so Agnes goes on to build monasteries, and she builds some friar complexes there that house the Franciscan friars. She also houses the Poor Clare nuns there, and she has a hospital she's built. It's a very large Gothic religious complex, and one of the first like that in that area. So she establishes this place. She becomes a nun herself. And so instead of, again, living a life of royalty, she is totally humbling herself and surrendering herself to God's will. And she's like cooking for people and dealing with lepers and other sick people. And eventually, this hospital complex was handed over to a order of knights, which is recognized by the Pope as well. But she continued to stay there and work, leading the monastery, and she worked there for the rest of her life until she died, which was like 50 total years. So a great example of a rejection of the material world, a rejection of the faux importance of wealth and status and everything, and a true devotion and sacrifice and surrender to Christ's will and a humbling of oneself. And then on the other hand, we have Blessed Charles the Good, and his father was King Canute of Denmark, also known as Saint Canute of Denmark. So he's also born into royalty, the child of a king, except his father is assassinated. He was then taken in by his maternal grandfather, who was Count Robert of Flanders, and stayed with him, and became quite the accomplished knight. He even went on one of the crusades in the Holy Land and fought alongside his grandfather. He later fought against the English as well as a knight. And after Robert died, Charles stuck around and was a good advisor to his son, the new count. And when the new count himself died in battle, he assigned for Charles to be his successor. And he was regarded as a very wise, loving, caring, and just ruler. In particular, he was known to give away lots of money, to give away even the clothes off his own back to people in need. He fought against predatory business practices where the big influential farming families would like hoard grain and raise prices, which tremendously hurt the common man. And his actions to fight against these very powerful, influential families eventually did result in his own demise, as they all conspired to overthrow him. And one day when he was praying in church, all his enemies did get together and murdered him. And he even knew that it was coming. He was warned that these people were planning this coup against him in order to kill him. And he remarked that Christ's enemies are everywhere, and that it wouldn't stop him from doing what he's supposed to do, and whatever happens to him happens. And he did end up dying. Again, I think that his story is one of great humility and sacrifice in a different way than Agnes, because he doesn't renounce or revoke his kingship or his royalty or anything like that, but he does use it in order to help the common man, right? Even till the very end, where in bravery against his opposition, he accepts God's will. Whatever happens will happen. He refused to stray from the path that he was set on. The miracle discussion for today is on the Shroud of Turin, maybe the most important Christian artifact in history. It's one of the most studied and analyzed things ever. So let's talk about it. What it is the burial cloth of Christ, or that's what it's believed to be, is the burial cloth of Christ. It appears to depict a crucified man with wounds that would match those of Christ around the head, the side, the hands, feet, lacerations on the back from being whipped. But most importantly is this after image left on the cloth that looks like it resembles a person, the person who was wrapped in it. It originally was gifted to a knight in the year 1354, and there's no real record of it before that time. And pretty soon after, it was actually displayed. The bishop at the time, the local bishop, had said that, oh, it's a fake, it's been painted, it's not real, but the Pope refused to comment on it. Since then, it's been analyzed and looked at again and again and again, most popes since then attesting to its authenticity. In the 70s, they had tried to figure out how exactly the image of whoever was wrapped in it appears on the cloth. They're saying, okay, are these different sort of paints painting this image? Is it dyes? Has it been scorched? That was like a common thing where it's like it was lightly burned in order to put that image in there. And none of the tests were really conclusive. In the 80s, they did another test on it where they determined that the cloth was only a few hundred years old, so that it couldn't possibly be the cloth that Christ was wrapped in because they're like, look, this thing's between the years like 1200 and 1400. It's not old enough to even be authentic. However, further study using some more advanced techniques, including the wide angle X ray scattering, analyzed pieces of the shroud and found that the structural degradation of the shroud's linen was fully compatible with other linen samples that have been dated to be around 55 to 75 AD, which totally aligns with the timeline that we're talking about, and that the actual fibers that the cloth is made out of also comes from the region that Christ would be in. So we knew conclusively that it's from the time of Christ, made in that region as well, and that 80s study had some contamination that contributed to the discrepancy of the years. But they did say, hey, look, in the 80s when they did that, they were wrong. There was something wrong with the sample. It was contaminated. We're conclusively saying now that it is authentic in the way that it does come from the time of Christ and the region. Okay, so you hear all that and you may think that, okay, that's pretty cool. That's pretty neat that we might have that. But why is it such a big deal other than, maybe it's Jesus's cloth? But it's not just that, oh, the wounds match up and it could have been the cloth he was wrapped in. That's not even the crazy part about it. That's nothing miraculous necessarily about that other than the fact that we have it. The truly miraculous part of it is what is that impression left on the cloth? Because like I said earlier, they tried to determine, is it paint? Has it been burned? What actually is this impression where you can see the figure of Christ? And when you do like the photo negative of it, you can see pretty clearly what he looked like fully. And he doesn't look like any of the modern depictions where they're like, well, Jesus wouldn't have looked like that. He would have looked like this. And they give you some depiction of what he, quote unquote, would have looked like. The Jesus that is depicted in the Shroud looks pretty much exactly like the way he's been depicted for 2,000 years. Like it looks exactly like the painting you have on your wall or the statue that you have, it looks just like that Jesus. But also, when it comes to how that impression was left, it was confirmed that it was not created by dyes, chemicals, vapors, scorching, or brushstrokes. That in fact it was caused by what they're calling, these scientists in Italy, what they're calling a flash of light, a sudden, intense, short-term pulse of radiation caused this outline in the cloth. They say they've done testing with similar things like UV light or something to produce similar results, and they're saying that based on what they have, they are saying that this isn't a painting, this isn't a hoax, this isn't something from the medieval times to try and fool people, that it is in fact the burial cloth of Christ that has a supernatural image on it. And even one of the scientists is Jewish, and if you know, Jews are not the biggest fan of Jesus Christ. Even the Jewish scientist said that there is only one answer here, that the cloth did indeed wrap the body of Jesus. And when it comes to explaining this burst of radiation, there is no way at that time period to replicate that. There's no way to forge that. There's no way to make that happen other than some supernatural event that cannot be explained. I've commonly seen people say like that was Jesus's soul leaving his body, and at the moment of when his soul leaves, it creates that after image. Who knows for sure what it is? But what we do know is that we have a true, undeniable miracle with the Shroud of Turin that has a supernatural image of Christ on it that could not have appeared there any way that we know of. We know it's not fake, it's not a forgery, it's not a painting, it's not anything else. It is truly unexplainable. And there have been scientists that look into it as skeptics and end up converting to Christianity after looking into it because of how compelling the evidence is that this is legitimate. And any time in my personal life when somebody says, where's the proof? Where's the concrete proof that I can touch in my hands that God's real and all that stuff? Always point them to the Shroud of Turin, because anybody who legitimately looks into it with an open mind, right, probably will end up converting because it is a tangible miracle that we have, which is mind-blowing to say the very least. That'll do it for today. Please let me know what you thought about the show in the comments. Anything I missed, anything I left out when it came to the readings, agree or disagree. Let me know your favorite saint and why, and is that your confirmation saint also? And let me know of any miracles that you would like me to cover on future episodes. Be sure to rate the episode, subscribe, all that stuff, and I will see you in the next one. Take care.